Hello and welcome to this chess endgame demonstration of a rook versus three pawns. And so why is it a good idea to study rook endgames? Well, because they occur fairly often, and along with bishops of opposite colors, they happen to have a lot of draws. So even when behind by a pawn, in bishops of opposite colors and in rook endgames, it is easier to draw when you're behind by a pawn. But here we don't have a rook on the other side, but three pawns versus the rook. And so with white to move here, how can white hold a draw in this position? Well, if we take a look at it, it looks like we have these two pawns over here that the king is trying to hold back. But the immediate problem is this pawn on a3, which is attempting to promote to a queen here. And so with white to move, what would you do here? Pause the video if you need to look at it further. If not, let's take a look here at the analysis. All right, so here it is even, so white can draw this position. Now, how to do that? Well, when it comes to rook endgames, a good rule to remember is that rooks belong behind passed pawns. And why is that? Well, they can have more mobility and be less passive behind the pawn. They just have more activity and mobility behind the pawn. And we'll show you an example of how that works here. So rook to a8 would be a good place to start, getting behind that pawn. Now, once you're behind the pawn, black, it looks like will move to king to b3 to help push this pawn forward. And here the king can move forward. And now we have pawn to a3, getting ready to try and promote here. But after the king moves a little closer, now finally the black king moves up to help promote this pawn. But to hold this endgame, you can play rook to b8 and just start checking this king. And if the king moves away, you just attack the pawn again. So the king would have to move back to protect the pawn, and then you just check again. And so the game would just end in a draw here, unless black were to make a mistake, such as this move. Now we see the game is immediately jumped in white's favor here. And the king can just move closer. And if the pawn tries to move, because now we have the king just trapped. The king has trapped itself here in front of its pawn. The rook is holding it in place. And now the king just moves closer, and this pawn will not promote in time. So now the rook swings over because the king is trapping black's king here. And after the pawn moves, we have a rook mate here. So that is what black does not want to do. So in this position back here, instead of moving to a1, it looks like it would just be better for black to just move back and forth, and a draw would be agreed because this rook would just keep attacking the king and the pawn. Now, another option, if we go back to the beginning, if you have the option, you always want to, well, not always, because every position may have some differences in it, but in general, you want to put your rooks behind passed pawns. Now, something that is not good would be, instead of going to rook to a8, would be rook to c1. So here, this is a bad move. You don't want to try and get in front of the pawn like this. So after the pawn moves, now this makes no sense because now the king can just come up and attack as long as the king is able to protect this pawn. Now we have king to g4. So white's last chance was to move rook to f1 back here. So instead of moving his king to g4 after king to b3 by black, this rook has to move out of there. And so rook to f1 would be a decent move, because now the rook cannot check from behind, up as it did in the previous example. So now the second best option is to check from the side. So rook to f2, the king will just be forced to move, and then the checks will just keep coming. If the king moves too far away, the rook will be able to just snatch up this pawn. So the king would have to stay near the pawn, and it would be a draw again. Now, what we don't want to do as white is after this, we don't want to let the king, jump right up in here, attack the rook, and now the rook has to move, but the pawn will be able to promote. And now after this capture, here black is winning because white cannot stop both of these pawns. If he moves up towards the pawns, well then we have one pawn pushing forward, and if the king moves up here to g6, the king cannot capture this rear pawn without the front pawn moving forward and running away and promoting. So the king would just have to move back and forth here, keeping an eye on these pawns, but the opposite king would move up and take advantage of the limited options of this white king and eventually just push the pawns forward. Here, black just takes control of the queening square, and now the pawns can be pushed forward. And the game may end like this. Now he can give up that rear pawn because the front pawn will promote, and black would be winning in this position. So that is an example of what white does not want to do. So if we go back to the beginning position, just remember rooks belong behind passed pawns, where they can check. In this situation, they can just check the king. If the king moves away from protecting the pawn, then the pawn can be attacked. And if you cannot get behind a passed pawn, then second best would be to check from the side, attack from the side, checking the king back and forth. And only as a last resort would you want to put your rook in front of the pawn, because we see as the pawn pushes forward more, when the rook is in front, it has very limited options. It can only go, if we had the rook, let's say at a2 here, it could only move up and down from a1 to a2. Of course it could move out to the side, but if you get behind a pawn that is moved forward, you have many more squares on this A file for your rook to move to, and just more options, and the piece is just more active. The rook is more active behind a pawn. Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed this little endgame demonstration of a rook versus 3 pawns. And just remember to study rook endgames because they come up quite a bit. And even when both sides have rooks and there is only one pawn difference, then it is likely that you may be able to pull a draw out of that game even behind by a pawn. So study your rook endgames and it will help you improve your chess. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. Feel free to leave comments or suggestions. Thank you and have a great day, everyone.